Okay, let's delve deep into our first topic in the integumentary system, the layers of skin. So epidermis, hypodermis, and dermis. That's what we're talking about today. All right, here are the standards and objectives. Pause and peruse if you wish. All right, so the layers of the integument, the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. Okay, the hypodermis is sometimes called the subcutaneous layer or the fatty layer. However, we're including it here in our discussion. What are the three layers of skin? Do you remember? We just talked about them. The epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. Epidermis most superficial, hypodermis most deep. Okay, let's start at the top, most superficial, epidermis. Let's talk epidermis. So, stratified squamous epithelium. Thick skin has 5 layers. Where do we find it? Well, palms and soles. Thin skin only has 4 layers. The layers or strata are stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basale. So, quick note, it takes about 2 to 4 weeks from cells to go from the stratum basale all the way up to the stratum corneum, and then about 2 weeks later, those cells will be shed. So maybe 6 weeks or so, your skin is going to be replaced. All right, so how many layers are in the epidermis? So you have to remember the difference between thick and thin skin. So it should be 5 in thick skin, but only 4 in thin skin. The epidermis, we're going to start superficially. So stratum corneum, most superficial layer. It has about 15 to 30 layers of flat, dead, keratinized, also called cornified, epithelial cells. The surface is relatively dry, which means it's unsuitable for the growth of many pathogens, so that provides some inherent protection. And the cells are still tightly connected, so generally the cells are shed in large groups or sheets instead of individual cells, and this is found in dust. So a big part of dust are cells from the stratum corneum. Then we have the stratum lucidum. Lucidum meaning very clear. It's only present in thick skin. It's a clear layer. The granules of keratin have broken open. The cells are dead, they're flattened, they're densely packed and filled with keratin. Now, the stratum granulosum, so granules, that's going to be key here. Here the cells stop dividing. They produce granules, hence granulosum, that contain keratin, so that's that waterproofing protein, but there's also fat, and there's a natural moisturizing factor. Okay, stratum spinosum, so think spiny. So it gives some strength to epidermis because it's got these spiny protrusions, so they really connect the cells together, so the cells are held tightly. And it helps prevent tearing and blistering because blisters are going to form when those layers separate, so this helps to prevent that. The cells continue to divide here, so there's dividing happening here in the spinosum. Okay, stratum basale, bottom. It's the deepest layer. It's firmly attached to the basement membrane. It has lots of cell division happening here because of stem cells, the keratinocytes. Also contains melanocytes here that produce melanin to provide UV protection. And it forms epidermal ridges, so these parts that go up and down, right? It increases contact between the epidermis and the dermis. First, so there's more diffusion, so the epidermis gets materials that it needs and gets to get rid of waste, but also because it keeps the epidermis and the dermis tightly connected, so the epidermis isn't going to slide over and create injury. So what layer of the epidermis contains melanocytes? The stratum basale. What layer of the epidermis is most superficial? Stratum corneum. What is the deepest layer of the epidermis? Stratum basale. What epidermal layer is only present in thick skin? Stratum lucidum. Okay, what are the 5 layers of the epidermis in order from superficial to deep? Do you remember them? Should be corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, basale. Stratum in front of all of them. Stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, stratum basale. Now, epidermal ridges. Let's talk about those a little bit. Talked about them briefly. Epidermal ridges are formed in the stratum basale of the epidermis, which is, the stratum basale is just a single layer of cells, single layer of stem cells. Dermal papillae extend upward from the dermis in between those ridges. So why is this important? I talked about this a little bit. It increases surface area for diffusion, because remember the epidermis is avascular, so it's got to get its nutrients from the blood vessels in the dermis. But also, this is what creates our fingerprints, which are a little bit important for grip. Like evolutionarily, we didn't get fingerprints as a form of identification. That's just also happened. It's for grip. All right, the dermis. It is deep to the epidermis. It has a connection to other body systems. So there's blood vessels, the circulatory system. It has nerve fibers, the nervous system. It has lymph vessels, the lymphatic system. There are 2 layers, the papillary dermis and the reticular dermis. So the papillary dermis, let's talk about this one first. It's named after the dermal papillae, those parts of the dermis that bulge upward in between those epidermal ridges. It's loose connective tissue. It supports and nourishes the epidermis. So remember, it means it has a lot of blood vessels. So it contains capillaries and nerves for sensation and for supplying nutrients and removing wastes from the cells of the epidermis. Now the reticular layer, that's the deeper layer. So papillary, more superficial, then reticular layer is more deep. This has dense irregular connective tissue. So this is dense connective tissue, but the irregular kind. It's not a tendon, it's not a ligament. It's a lot of collagen and a lot of elastic fibers for flexibility. So the collagen fibers, they limit flexibility, but prevent damage. The elastic fibers allow for flexibility. Which layer of the dermis is most superficial? That's the papillary, like the papilla. What layer of the dermis contains dense connective tissue? Reticular. The papillary is loose. Okay, and finally, the hypodermis. It is the deepest or subcutaneous layer. It is the site of subcutaneous injections. So injections are often given here because it's not just capillaries, larger blood vessels are present here. It is loose connective tissue. So we had the dermis, which was loose, then dense, now in the hypodermis, loose, mostly adipose tissue, fat. So it's a lot of fat cells, adipose cells, which helps to reduce heat loss. It helps provide energy reserve, and it's a shock absorber, provides protection. No vital organs are here in the hypodermis. Bigger blood vessels, again, that makes sense for why injections would be given here. What are the 3 layers of skin in order from superficial to deep? Epidermis, dermis, hypodermis. Remember the epidermis, 5 layers, dermis, 2 layers, hypodermis, just 1. And there you have it. That's the layers of the skin, the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. And you know it, I hope you learned something new today.